Welcome back to Meidas Defense. I'm Joe Plenzler. If you step inside the Pentagon right now or tune into a White House press briefing, you're going to hear a lot of chest thumping about our current military operations against Iran. You'll hear about conventional success, you'll hear numbers, enemy air defense nodes obliterated, and ballistic missile production facilities smashed, and conventional Iranian naval hulls sitting at the bottom of the Gulf. And operationally, from a purely tactical standpoint, those numbers are real. Our service members are performing with incredible skill, but there is a massive gaping disconnect between tactical success and strategic reality. Because while the Pentagon touts conventional numbers, the Strait of Hormuz, the absolute lifeblood of global energy commerce, remains effectively closed to regular international shipping. We recently sat down with Mark Cancian, senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, retired Marine Corps colonel, and the man who spent decades analyzing military budgets and force structure for the government. And right out of the gate, Mark shattered the administration's narrative. He pointed out that what the White House viewed as a contained, predictable cycle of deterrence has completely spiraled. Listen to how Mark sets the stage for where we are in this conflict right now and the chilling political chess move Iran is playing in the Gulf.
Well, I'm most focused on what happens between the U.S. and Iran regarding the ceasefire. Of course, that has been fraying increasingly over the last couple of days. We went through a couple of weeks of tit-for-tat strikes. They would do something, we would do something, we would do something, they would do something. But the last couple of days, that has escalated. The administration thought that they took down one of our helicopters. We struck back. They believed that it would end there. It did not. So the Iranians struck again. We struck them. They struck us. Now it looks like we're going to strike them again. So this thing could spiral back into full-scale conflict. It is interesting that the Israelis have not been involved in this last series of attacks. It's also interesting that the Iranians have only struck Kuwait, Jordan, and Bahrain. They have not struck the other Gulf countries. And it seems that they are trying to split the Gulf countries into those that are more aligned with the United States and maybe those who are less aligned.
Mark is identifying a calculated political strategy by Tehran. They're trying to split the Gulf coalition, but why do they have the leverage to do that? Because they have done something the United States Navy explicitly exists to prevent. They have choked off the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if you're a student of military history or if you study the Middle East, this isn't a new problem. The Navy and the U.S. Central Command have been studying, gaming, and planning for an Iranian attempt to close the strait for literally 45 years. We went through the tanker wars in the 80s. I remember sitting in military schools running sand table exercises on very similar scenarios. When this crisis hit, the plan should have been executed flawlessly, right? Wrong. Mark calls it out for what it is, a massive historic strategic failure by the U.S. Navy. The assets simply weren't where they were needed to be because the administration rushed into this conflict blind, driven by hubris from smaller operations like Midnight Hammer and the abduction of Maduro in Venezuela. Here's Mark breaking down the logistical reality of how the Navy dropped the ball from week one.
I regard this as a huge strategic failure by the Navy. They have been thinking about this problem for literally 45 years. Since the 1980s and the tanker wars, when the Navy escorted tankers through the Persian Gulf for essentially the same reasons. That is, Iran was harassing shipments of oil.
Yeah.
And as a junior Marine officer, I remember participating in amphibious planning exercises to capture Keshem Island, which is in the Strait of Hormuz. And of course, CENTCOM has been thinking about that literally for 45 years, making plans. So the moment arrived, and then the U.S., particularly the Navy, was unable to keep the strait open. I think there's going to be a lot coming out in the future about what the planning was and what both the civilians and the military were thinking. The Navy clearly didn't put the assets in place that it would need to open the strait. Remember, it was a week into the war before the 31st MEU was sent to the Middle East. There was another 2 weeks before the 11th MEU was sent. So the pieces to keep the strait open were not there from the very beginning.
Let that sink in. A week into the war, before the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit is ordered to move, 2 weeks for the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, the critical amphibious pieces needed to raid Iranian missile nodes and control the geography of the choke point were missing from day one. So how did a nation without a major conventional navy pull this off against the most expensive fleet on Earth? They adapted. They watched modern conflict. They took a page out of the Ukrainian playbook in the Black Sea. They realized you don't need a multi-billion-dollar cruiser to deny sea control to a superpower. You just need to make the waters too dangerous for the enemy to risk their prized assets. They swarmed the strait with low-cost tech, mines, speedboats, ballistic missiles, and drones. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy is caught in a trap of its own, making what I call the amazing gobstoppers. Massive, ultra-expensive platforms that we are now terrified to actually send into a fight. Listen to how Mark draws the parallels between Iran's strategy and the naval revolution we're currently seeing globally.
The fact that the strait is mostly closed and remains mostly closed has been a strategic failure.
Yeah.
And the Iranians have done to the U.S. Navy what the Ukrainians did to the Russian Navy in the Black Sea, and that is, without any of the attributes of a conventional navy, exert control over a key waterway.
Yeah.
And the fact that we watched what the Iranians did and then we're not ready to counter that, I think is a great failure.
Is part of the problem is that the Navy keeps on building these amazing gobstoppers, these billion-dollar platforms in the age of swarm drone warfare. I mean, we saw this coming when I was in the Pentagon, 2010 to 2015, and we're scratching our heads like we're still building these big deck carriers when pretty clearly, even for the Commandant staff is like, yeah, the future's changing. Like the way that we fought in the past isn't going to be the way we're going to fight in the future. And why are we building these very large, expensive targets that could be fairly easily swarmed and taken out by a bunch of cheap drones? I mean, what's your thinking on that? Like, as you look to the future, given what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in the Gulf right now, are we once again falling in the trap of preparing to fight the last war?
Yeah. I mean, many people have made that argument, and the Navy is very open to that criticism.
Yeah.
And of course, what's happening in the Strait reinforces that criticism of the Navy, which has been around for a long time. Yep. People saying for decades that the Navy focuses too much on these exquisite platforms, the carriers, and now the battleship. No, but that's not really their fault.
Yeah.
But even the cruisers, the cruisers are $2.5 billion. And the fact that the Navy is unwilling to risk them is the greatest problem.
Yeah.
So you have to have some ships that you're willing to risk. And, the push, for example, a convoy through the Strait. I've heard some people say, well, it's just not possible to push convoys through defended areas. And I say, oh, yeah, tell that to the U.S. Navy in the Second World War in the North Atlantic.
That's right.
We pushed convoys through extremely dangerous waters. We took a lot of casualties, both to military and to the cargo ships, but we succeeded. So what is it now that prevents us from doing that?
What prevents us from doing that? That's the defining question. In World War II, the American public understood the stakes. They accepted casualties because the alternative was global defeat. Today, the administration has conditioned the public to expect zero casualty wars. Furthermore, because this administration has chosen a go-it-alone ethos, alienating European allies, bypassing Congress, even kicking the Pentagon press corps out of the building, they have failed to build any domestic consensus or international legitimacy for this conflict. And that lack of transparency has distorted how the world views this war. If you scroll through social media or watch the evening news, it looks like a balanced back and forth street fight. But Mark shared a striking statistic with us that reveals the true hidden scale of the destruction inside Iran and why the media landscape is deceiving us.
We have to be careful not to fall victim to the prejudice of what you see is all there is.
Yes, right.
The Kahneman,
it's a good point.
Because the Iranians have shut down all, the internet, and therefore we have very little insight into what's going on there. I think there's this notion that the war has been a kind of tit for tat. We strike them, they strike us, we strike them, they strike us. But during the height of the war, they were getting maybe 20 strikes in a day, getting missiles and drones through defenses, hitting maybe about 20 targets. At the same time, the U.S. and Israel were hitting 600 targets a day.
Right.
So it was one tit and 30 tats. But you didn't see the 30. You saw the one because, of course, those were in Gulf countries. They were in Israel, and everybody has a phone, and that was a well documented, and then that's fair, but it's not tit for tat, and the immense damage to the Iranians is not clear.
One tit for 30 tats. The physical damage to Iran's military infrastructure is astronomical. But as my old boss, General Jim Mattis, used to pound into our heads, the enemy always gets a vote. You can rain down 600 strikes a day, but if the regime is willing to absorb that punishment, and if they can still set enough commercial ships on fire to spook the Lloyds of Londons of the world to shut down global shipping, then your conventional superiority is functionally neutralized. Force only gets you so far if you cannot convert tactical wins into a diplomatic settlement. This brings us to the grand irony of the current administration's defense policy. They entered office explicitly telling the American people, judge us by the wars we don't fight. Yet we find ourselves deeply entangled in the Gulf, enforcing a medieval oil siege on Cuba, and requesting an unprecedented $1.5 trillion defense budget without articulating a clear, coherent strategy to the American taxpayers who are footing the bill. Here's Mark's final warning on the administration's strategy messaging gap.
The watching what the Trump administration does next, they came into office committed to stopping foreign wars.
Yeah.
You may remember the inaugural address where Trump said, "Judge us by the wars that we don't fight." Mm-hmm. And those same words are in the national security strategy. And of course, we've been fighting wars continuously since the beginning of the administration. So seeing whether there's any follow-on Cuba, for example, whether there's a renewed focus on the Western Pacific. One of the tensions that we see is a reluctance, at least by the president, to say that our military preparations are aimed at least deterring China. On the other hand, requesting a $1.5 trillion budget. And a lot of people say, well, why do you want $1.5 trillion? And the administration has really not laid that out. Now, it's very possible to do that, to say, we want to have a robust deterrence against China and the Western Pacific and also maintain global capabilities because superpowers are often called for various regional crises, even though we are going to rely primarily on our local allies and partners. I think perfectly reasonable statement, but they haven't made that.
And they haven't made the case. They haven't explained the math. They haven't explained why $1 trillion a year military apparatus was caught flat-footed at the world's most predictable maritime checkpoint. If there's one lesson to extract from Mark Cancian's analysis today, it's that hubris is not strategy. You cannot bully a determined adversary into submission with tactical numbers when they are playing an entirely different asymmetrical game. Until civilian leadership and naval planners align our massive defense spending with the actual realities of modern decentralized warfare, we will continue to achieve brilliant tactical victories that result in profound strategic failures. You can read Mark's full detailed breakdowns on global munitions inventories and theater force structures over at CSIS.org. And thanks for tuning in to Meidas Defense. Just hit that subscribe button, leave us a review, and stay vigilant. I'm Joe Plenzler. You can find me at Joe Plenzler on Substack. You can follow our deeper work at Valor Media on Substack and other social media channels. We'll see you next week.
Want to stay plugged in? Become a subscriber to our Substack at MeidasPlus.com. You'll get daily recaps from Ron Filipkowski, ad-free episodes of our podcast, and more exclusive content only available at MeidasPlus.com.